Something is unfolding right now that I genuinely never expected to witness in my lifetime, and I have spent years covering geopolitics and institutional power. 38 military commanders, both active duty and retired, including 7 four-star generals, have signed and released a joint public letter in which they refuse to endorse the current commander-in-chief's handling of military authority. This letter was released less than an hour ago. This is not a leak. This is not based on rumor. This is a formal, on-the-record public statement from individuals who built their entire careers around a single guiding principle. You do not publicly challenge civilian leadership. Ever. The fact that they broke that rule deliberately, collectively, and on camera tells you everything you need to understand about what they believe is at stake. To grasp why this moment carries so much weight, you have to understand what it took to reach this point. Over a period of several months, according to reporting from multiple outlets including The Washington Post and Politico, senior military figures had been observing a pattern developing inside the command structure. Not a single isolated incident, not a personality conflict, a pattern. Promotion decisions that sources say increasingly reflected perceived political loyalty. Operational briefings from which senior commanders were excluded when their previous assessments had contradicted administration messaging. And then came the moment that reportedly broke everything open. A directive dated February 9th. According to the letter and statements made at a press conference held at the National Press Club in Washington, the White House Chief of Staff placed a call to the Pentagon at 2:15 in the afternoon on February 9th. The acting Deputy Secretary of Defense was instructed to hold all authorization requests from 3 specific forward operating bases until further notice. When the Deputy Secretary asked for the reason, he was allegedly told something that every legal expert responding to the story today described as extraordinary. He was told that certain commanding officers needed to demonstrate a better understanding of administration priorities before operational support could continue. Read that carefully. Operational support, meaning equipment, authorizations, resupply logistics for troops in the field, was allegedly conditioned on commanders showing political alignment. 2 hours after that call, according to the letter, those same 3 base commanders received calls from a White House political advisor inviting them to appear in a televised roundtable on February 14th to publicly praise administration defense policies. The message, if the account is accurate, could not have been clearer. Appear, endorse, and the authorizations move forward. Decline, and your troops wait. This story only makes full sense when you understand how deeply it breaks with American military tradition. In April of 1951, President Truman removed General Douglas MacArthur during the Korean War after MacArthur publicly advocated for expanding the conflict into China, directly contradicting presidential orders. Even MacArthur, who returned home to enormous public support, accepted that decision because the constitutional principle outweighed any individual general. In December of 1993, General Colin Powell disagreed with President Clinton over policy regarding gay service members. Powell testified before Congress, expressed his concerns through proper channels, and then carried out the policy because he never crossed the line between offering advice and openly challenging civilian authority. In October of 2019, Defense Secretary James Mattis resigned after President Trump ordered a withdrawal from Syria without consulting Pentagon leadership. His resignation letter was widely discussed and diplomatically devastating, yet even Mattis maintained the tradition of not publicly attacking a sitting president for nearly 2 years after leaving office. Today is different. These 38 leaders did not wait for retirement. They did not use diplomatic language. They did not work through private channels or classified testimony. They walked into the National Press Club, stood at a podium, and read a public statement on camera. Journalists present described the atmosphere as unlike anything they had ever witnessed at a military-related press event. Standing at the podium was General Marcus Caldwell, a retired four-star Army general and former Joint Chiefs Vice Chairman, flanked by Admiral Jennifer Hartley, a retired Navy admiral who commanded the Pacific Fleet, and Lieutenant General Robert Hayes, a retired Marine Corps officer who led forces across 3 combat theaters. General Caldwell read the opening statement, which Reuters confirmed and pool reporters in the room verified. He stated that they had served under presidents from both parties and had never publicly questioned civilian leadership, but that they could not remain silent when operational decisions affecting the safety of American service members were being subordinated to political calculations. And then came the line already being cited by constitutional scholars across the political spectrum. The principle of civilian control of the military is sacred, but that control carries a responsibility to act in the national interest, not personal interest. That sentence matters enormously. These generals are not arguing against civilian control. They are arguing that what they witnessed was not civilian control at all. It was civilian exploitation. That distinction is going to sit at the center of every legal and constitutional debate that follows. According to Admiral Hartley's statement, one of the 3 forward operating bases that had its authorizations delayed was subsequently subjected to increased hostile fire on February 11th and 12th, just 48 hours after the White House directive. Hartley was careful to state that there is no direct evidence linking the authorization delay to the security incident, but she also confirmed that the base commander had specifically requested enhanced defensive systems that were part of the delayed authorization package, and those systems were not in place when the attack occurred. 3 American service members were wounded. The base sustained significant damage to its communications infrastructure. There were no fatalities. But that fact does not change the core question. If the account is accurate, troops may have faced increased risk not because of strategic constraints, budget limitations, or any legitimate military calculation, but because their commander had not agreed to appear on camera for a White House event. Constitutional scholars and former federal officials have been responding to this story in real time, and their assessments carry significant weight. Professor Elizabeth Warren, a constitutional law expert at Georgetown University and former Assistant Attorney General, told CNN that if the allegations are substantiated, they raise serious questions about violations of the president's fundamental duties as commander-in-chief. She noted that while the Constitution grants the president broad authority over military operations, that authority exists to serve national security objectives, not to extract political loyalty from officers who are supposed to provide independent professional military advice. Michael Chertoff, a former federal judge and Homeland Security Secretary under President George W. Bush, added that the allegations could potentially implicate multiple federal statutes prohibiting the use of government resources for campaign purposes. In his view, delaying military operations to coerce political endorsements from active duty commanders is not simply an abuse of authority. It could constitute violations of laws specifically designed to prevent political manipulation of military resources. There is a detail being underreported in the initial wave of coverage that is absolutely essential to understanding the full scope of this situation. According to sources inside the Pentagon speaking to multiple reporters, the 38 signatories represent only a fraction of the flag officers who wanted to participate. Military Legal Counsel reportedly advised at least a dozen additional active duty officers that signing the letter could constitute violations of Department of Defense regulations prohibiting political activity by uniformed personnel. They could not sign, not because they disagreed with the letter, but because they are still serving and are legally constrained from doing so. The 38 who went public are the ones who could go public because they have retired. The officers currently in command positions, currently managing these pressures in real time, are watching from the sidelines, legally unable to add their voices. A retired 3-star general speaking to the Washington Post on condition of anonymity confirmed that informal discussions among senior military leaders about how to respond to what they described as accelerating politicization had been ongoing for at least 6 months. The group reportedly considered every alternative, including a private meeting with the president, working through the Secretary of Defense, and providing classified testimony to the Senate Armed Services Committee. Each option had a critical flaw. A private meeting could be dismissed without public accountability. The Secretary of Defense appeared unwilling to confront the president directly, and classified testimony would keep the information entirely away from the American people. So they chose transparency, career officers who spent their lives following orders, deciding that following orders had become complicity in the destruction of the institution they had dedicated their lives to building. That is not an impulsive decision. That is not political opportunism. That is a strategic calculation made over months by some of the most disciplined institutional thinkers in American public life. Looking ahead, there are 2 realistic paths from here. The first is accountability. The Senate Armed Services Committee had already, before this letter was released, voted 11-0 in a bipartisan closed session to formally request that the Pentagon Inspector General launch an immediate investigation into the February 9th directive. That investigation, if it proceeds, will attempt to establish whether the directive existed, what it actually said, who issued it, and what operational consequences followed. If the investigation confirms the account laid out in the letter, the legal and political implications would be historic. Military families would have documented evidence that the safety of their loved ones was treated as a bargaining chip. Republicans in Congress would face an impossible choice between political loyalty and institutional credibility. And the legal exposure for officials involved could extend well beyond public embarrassment. The second path is a downward spiral. The White House response released at 4:23 in the afternoon did not address the specific allegations. It did not dispute the existence of the February 9th directive. It did not offer alternative context or documentation. Instead, it launched personal attacks against General Caldwell and Admiral Hartley by name, calling them, in the president's own words on Truth Social, failures and losers who could not win wars and were probably being paid by Democrats to undermine a president who had rebuilt the military they allowed to decay. When the response to specific documented allegations is personal attacks rather than factual dispute, and when the obvious move of simply releasing the actual directive to provide context does not happen, legal communication experts will tell you that is not a defense strategy. That is a signal that no factual defense is available. If the spiral path continues, if personal attacks replace accountability, if the investigation is blocked or buried, if Republicans in Congress decide that political loyalty outweighs the testimony of 38 decorated military leaders, the precedent being set is catastrophic. Future presidents of any party will have learned that military operations can be conditioned on political loyalty without consequence. Future commanders will understand that the path to promotion runs through political alignment rather than operational excellence. And future adversaries will factor into their calculations the possibility that American military decisions are influenced by domestic political theater rather than strategic necessity. That is not a sustainable foundation for a country whose global security depends on military credibility. As of this evening, 38 military leaders with distinguished records, centuries of combined service, and no history of political involvement have publicly declared that operational military decisions were conditioned on political loyalty to the president. The Senate Armed Services Committee has voted in a bipartisan fashion to request an Inspector General investigation. Constitutional scholars across the political spectrum have called the allegations, if substantiated, among the most serious civil-military crises in modern American history. 3 service members were wounded at a base that had specifically requested defensive systems included in a delayed authorization package. and the White House response did not dispute a single specific fact that was presented. This is not theoretical. This is not a policy debate. This is a question about whether the most fundamental principle in American constitutional democracy, that the military serves the nation and not the political interests of whoever holds the presidency, still holds. That compact has survived previous crises of civil-military relations across the last century. The question being asked right now is whether the institution is strong enough to survive this one. When career officers who spent 30 or 40 years never once speaking publicly about a sitting president decide that staying silent has become complicity, that moment deserves to be understood in its full weight, not filtered through partisan framing, and not reduced to just another episode in the news cycle.